Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel session today, which is Setting the World's Goals Post-2015. I'm very honored and excited to have the group that we have this afternoon because I think they're very representative of the dynamic process that's happening right now and that I know this community is very invested in. I'm going to introduce the panelists, make a few framing remarks, and then invite each of them to speak from their own perspectives, which I think will be illuminating for you all. Have some general questions for them, and then open it up for your inquiries and what's pressing for you. So to my far right is Lysa John. Lysa has a wonderful resume as a global activist, having previously been affiliated with GCAP. She now does civil society inclusion and organization for the high-level panel of eminent persons. She also is doing this really interesting thing. She is pursuing a PhD in digital activism and its relevance to socially excluded communities. If she'd gotten here earlier, I would have asked her more about it, but I'm going to ask her more about it later because I think that's just an amazing idea that she's carrying around in her head. Immediately to my right is Don Steinberg, well known to you all, Deputy Administrator of USAID. He has held numerous and amazing high-level posts. I think what's funny is if you work with someone on a regular basis, you don't know all the cool stuff they've done with their lives. But he has been Director of the State Department's Joint Policy Council, the White House Deputy Press Secretary, National Security Council Senior Director for African Affairs, Special Haiti Coordinator, U.S. Ambassador to Angola, President's Special Representative on Humanitarian Demining. He served as officer in charge at the embassy in Pretoria during the country's transition from apartheid to democracy, and has had postings in Mauritius, Brazil, Malaysia, and the Central African Republic. In addition to all this public service, he has authored more than 100 articles. So I think that's just amazing.
Can't keep a job.
Can't keep a job. And then immediately to my left is Jean-Michel Severino. I told Jean-Michel that he was unusual because he had edited a book published in 2010 called Africa's Moment, and it's about impact investing. He now runs a firm in Paris that is about implementing what he's written about. So most of us write about things and tell other people how to do it, and then they do it, and we tell them what's wrong. So he's very brave. He's also a member of the high-level panel of eminent persons who will be issuing their report at the end of May. He has been the French development minister and has held numerous high-level...
Director of French Emergency.
So, but he has had a very distinguished career of service and also action in the private sector. And then to my far left is the talented Carolyn Miles. She has been with Save the Children since 1998. She is currently the CEO. Her previous life was with American Express and as an entrepreneur in South Asia. And her biography says that during her time in Asia, she became motivated to address the needs of children. And another person who is walking the talk and Save the Children, both in the U.S. and globally, has been a great leader in the MDG dialogue. So I'm very, very happy that Carolyn could join us. This is a really exciting moment. Last year we had an MDG conversation, and I can already feel through our task force at Interaction how this conversation has really moved. And we're at a different moment than we were in 2000. Large numbers have been lifted out of poverty, in some cases through a variety of means, but a lot of it is about economic development, but that's not been equal. We have a moral imperative right now that we didn't have in 2000 to sort of finish what we started. So while there's lots of energy around what's next, there's also how do we finish what we started. There's been a lot of discussion about really important principles like sustainability and universality, addressing inequality, but at the same time, there's a clamor of individual sectors and individual interests. The Interaction Task Force on the post-2015 agenda was told recently by the UN that they had received 350, more than 350 recommendations of individual sectors that must be measured. Like all of these were equally important. So we're in this paradoxical moment right now where we've got to move from the general principles to the particulars. We've got to finish, yet we have to move ahead. We have huge challenges to address. So I'm sure that by the end of this hour, we will all have figured it out, and we can just go forth and do. I'm grateful, though, to have the smart people here who will sort of help frame our conversation and then move us along. So I'm going to start with Jean-Michel. The MDGs have, should they have a sustainability agenda? And what does that look like? I hear a lot of confusion about what does it mean to have sustainability added to, or is it integrated? Could you speak to that for us?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thrilled to be here with you and engage in this conversation. The question that you're putting, Lindsay, is exactly what we are trying to struggle with in this panel. What has come very strongly in the now year of discussions that we have had amongst panel members and listening to all the stakeholders from so many countries and sectors that have discussed with us. So what has come very strongly is that the idea that we have now to move towards a much more global agenda than the MDGs. And myself coming from the development community was struck and at the beginning a little bit destabilized by the strength with which this message comes. Even from developing countries, let's have a new set of goals that is not just about how developing countries should improve their situation and how about OECD countries should assist them in making progress. But let's try to move towards a global agenda that is applicable to everybody and into which everybody in the world commits, whether rich or poor. And it leads immediately to the issue of sustainability. Because obviously, the only way to move into this type of agenda is to speak about sustainability with its three pillars, the economics, the social, the environmental, maybe a fourth pillar about the cultural dimension of development, but whatever, you have to encompass all dimensions in order to gather situations, all the situations that are created by the global commons, the global public goods. And of course it has strong consequences on ODA and the way people look at development finance. And I've also been struck by the fact that in this debate, less stress has been put on ODA than I would have suspected or probably would have been put 10 years earlier on. Obviously, the fact that the economic situation has changed, the developing countries are making a lot of economic progress, the emerging countries are on top of the hill. Many OECD countries are facing important macroeconomic challenges. So this situation has also an influence, the fact that ODA is looked at with skepticism by developing countries who don't believe that it will increase because of those budgetary constraints. But also the improvement of the economic situation is opening new windows on new ways to fund development. And there are many coming from the market or from other innovative public dimensions. So now, and I shouldn't speak too long, but so the challenge is how you put that in a concrete way, which doesn't also lead to forget that poverty is still a very important issue, probably the most crucial one, at least on the short run. Maybe climate change is going to completely transform the world, but in the 5 coming years, poverty is still the key challenge. So how you capture this vastly changing way of looking at our issues while keeping the focus on poverty alleviation and not forgetting also that funding by government is one of the very few instruments that will be still at a discretionary that will be available in a discretionary way by democracies or regimes, all governments in the coming decade. But definitely, and I will stop there, it's very clear that we are moving towards a very new paradigm, that the goals that will, at least the way that this discussion on the future MDGs or SDGs is starting in a very different basis than the one that existed around the turn of the century.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's a great challenge to integrate these things. So another great challenge is one that President Obama threw down. I shouldn't say threw down about State of the Union, but he did kind of throw it down at the State of the Union to say that, you know, we're going to end poverty. Don, could you speak a little bit about about that vision and what you think, someone sitting holding the reins of power at USAID, what is it going to take to achieve that kind of a radical vision?
So I always learn that the safest thing in the world is to quote the President of the United States. So he said on February 12th, the United States will join with our allies to eradicate extreme poverty in the next 2 decades by connecting more people to the global economy, by empowering women, by giving our young and brightest minds new opportunities to serve, by helping communities feed, empower, and educate themselves, by saving the world's children from preventable deaths, and by realizing the promise of an AIDS-free generation. So I'm going to cancel my vacation in order to accomplish this goal. But if you think about what the President said, it is so consistent with the Millennium Development Goals. It is aspirational, it's ambitious, it's achievable. As you were saying, we have moved 600 million people across the poverty line in the last 15 years. It is also inspirational. It will inspire a new generation of Americans, giving them a challenge that takes them beyond themselves, to use their technological knowledge to contribute to this brand new world. And as he went through the various areas, he described technology, gender, youth, food security, energy, education, and child survival. And so those are indeed the goals that we look at. To pick up on the previous comments, we do see poverty eradication as a driving influence in this process. We also see environmental sustainability as having to come into the play. But perhaps most importantly for me personally is the notion of inclusivity of what the MDGs are going to look like. And I mean that in 2 ways. First of all, we have gone beyond the point where we think development equals 6 and 8 and 10% growth rates. We recognize that development must produce growth that's equitable, that is distributed well, that results in housing and healthcare and education for populations, and that creates jobs for young people. Development of 6 and 8 and 10% growth took place in Egypt over the course of the last decade. And yet we saw bad distribution of wealth, corruption, lack of jobs, and the result was a social revolution that, despite being necessary, has proved extremely costly to the development priorities. But secondly, the inclusivity has to involve all parts of society in development. Development is a whole of society exercise, and we talk a lot about that being government and civil society and the business sector and others, but it also means previously marginalized groups. It means women, it means young people, it means people with disabilities, it means the LGBT community, ethnic minorities, indigenous populations. They all have to be part of the goals of the MDG, not only as beneficiaries, but as planners, as implementers, and contributors. That's how we're going to get to this completion.
That's inspiring. That's inspiring. So, Carolyn, you've gotten a perfect opening.
I do.
with
I
your,
do have a perfect opening.
with the preceding remarks. And I wanted you to talk about, those who will benefit most if we're successful with this endeavor are children. How do we hope children's lives might change under a post-2015 framework?
Well, let me start by just saying thank you to my three other panelists, Lysa, Don, and Jean-Michel, because I think they have been spending huge amounts of time on this issue. And I think for our community, for the NGO community, this is a really critical issue. And I do actually think this is all about children. So if we think about today's MDGs, they are about a 13-year-old, right? They are about what's the progress been for a 13-year-old, and how is that 13-year-old's life different today than it was in 2000. And the next set of development goals will be about, a 15-year-old in 2030. Because if we are not moving things ahead for children, then just by definition, we're not going to get the development we're looking for. So I think that's why Save the Children has actually spent a lot of time on this issue, because we think it is fundamentally about children. And one of the things that we looked at in the first set of MDGs, we actually have been tracking a set of children that were born in 2000. It's called the Young Lives Study, and we've actually been tracking those kids, and we have looked at what is the difference in their lives. And the MDGs, in some cases, in many cases, have made a tremendous difference, but what we found was the biggest issue is the inequalities in that progress. And I think the fractional approach of the first set of MDGs has somewhat driven that. If we're saying our goal is to lower child mortality by 2/3, it is going to lead us to a place where we are going to reach those that can be reached, so we can get to that goal. That's not a bad thing, but it does leave us with a very hard task, I think, going forward. So that was one of the things that we looked at as we developed a framework for post-2015. And we actually were able to develop a set of goals that fits on one sheet of paper, so it is doable. And I think one of the things that's so important about this strategy going forward, and we heard it this morning from some of the other speakers, is we can't lose sight of these things have to be inspirational, they have to be reachable, they have to be things that people are going to strive for, and they have to be clear. And I think getting it all on one sheet of paper was actually an exercise to try to force us to do that. 6 of these goals are about human development. They are focused on things like, again, education, and making sure that it's not just about education, but it's about kids that actually learn when they go to school. So it's about the quality, not just the access. They are about child mortality and maternal mortality. They do focus, first of all, on eradicating hunger, or eradicating poverty and hunger. So there are 6 of the goals that are quite focused on human development. And then there are 4 of the goals that are about context. Because I think when we think about how we're actually going to be successful in this next set of goals, we have to take into consideration the change in context, the dramatic change in context that's occurred. So those are things that it looks at energy, it looks at the environment, it looks at the idea of partnership that's going to be so important. So having these contextual goals together with the human development goals, I think, is a framework. We're not expecting that this is going to be taken up, just as it is, the one page, and here it is. But it has been, I think, very helpful in really advancing the conversation and making sure that this time we are much more inclusive, we really focus on inequality, and we remember that, again, this is about children and what's changed in their lives, because if we haven't done that over the 15-year period, we aren't going to get the progress that we want. So I think Save the Children is very invested in this, and we spent a lot of time on trying to put forth some ideas, and we think it's really important. So,
thank you, Carolyn. So Lysa, you sit as the Director of Outreach for the high-level panel, and I want you to talk with us about what you have noticed about civil society engagement in the post-2015 dialogue. Civil society is such a big term, like corporations or nation states are big terms, and encompasses a great deal of diversity. within that term of civil society. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of civil society engagement?
Okay, hello, and very glad to be here. My Twitter following actually went up by a few percentage points since this dialogue started, so thank you for my few minutes of digital fame. I think maybe the first point I want to make is that the post-2015 agenda is actually being recognized as a kind of a historic and unprecedented global conversation. That's the UN speak. But literally it means that over 400,000 people, not just from civil society, but actually citizens, academicians, private sector, public officers in terms of elected representatives have actually been directly engaged with this whole deliberation on what the post-2015 agenda should look like. I think this is the very first time that you've had an agenda setting exercise that brings people so directly into a multilateral conversation in the history of the UN. So I think that's something that we need to celebrate. It's something that we've all been calling for in all the, the last decade of the MDG campaigning that we've been doing. Having said that, I would say that as a global campaigner in my past life, my proudest moments really have been seeing very, very strong regional and national leadership for the debate in all the spaces that the high-level panel has been in. So in terms of the conversations that the high-level panel and other UN conversation streams have had, out of the global spaces of New York or London or the other kind of hubs, you've had very, very strong mobilizations in Africa, for instance, around the Monrovia meetings, or in Bali across Asia, the Arab Declaration on the post-2015 agenda. So you've had groups coming together and really making a push to see their local realities reflected in the global conversation. I think that's been extremely, extremely useful, and it really turns the criticism also of the MDG agenda on its head in terms of saying that we really need to build from the ground in terms of the aspirations and the recommendations that particularly the panel will put up. In terms of the way that civil society has worked, I mean, I would say it's been a case of thematic brilliance almost. I think a real effort to fine-tune the lessons, the insights, and the conversations around the key themes that we have seen in the MDG debate. So a lot of learning in terms of the work that has gone in over the last 8 to 9 years in really seeing what really worked, what didn't work with the MDG piece. But also a lot of innovation in terms of working with key actors to define new issues and challenges that were not really addressed effectively in the first phase. So Mr. Severino himself has been working with another panelist, Betty Minor, and a lot of groups across the global landscape to define the whole issue of informal sector much more strongly in the post-2015 agenda. We have a panelist from East Timor, Emilia Perez, who's been really the force behind the conflict and fragility conversation in the post-2015 debate. You also have a lot of other groups like the government of Mexico taking up migration very strongly and trying to define that, get civil society and other actors together. So I think that's been very exciting. I think the fact that people feel the space to go beyond just the formal boundaries of the UN conversation and define their own ways of representing the issues that are important to them. But having said that, I think the gap or the challenge I'm really seeing is a lot of uncertainty about the political strategy. I think that has to do both with the new kind of geopolitical terrain that we see. We're seeing countries being much more aggressive in terms of the say that they want to have in the post-2015 agenda. But I don't know whether we're fully equipped to see how civil society actually balances or plays a complementary role to that. So both a kind of a confusion of how the different UN processes link with each other from Rio+20 or Busan, so the global partnerships or the open working group, how does that fit into the post-2015 agenda? But also I think a fair amount of confusion of how do we actually then kind of converge across global civil society and national civil society and really make a much more stronger pitch to push the bar further on this whole debate.
Thank you, Lysa. Thank you. So I think that one of the ways, I want to go back to something that Jean-Michel started with, which is that when in 2000, we were much more in a model about, the conversation was about ODA. And now financing is a totally different set of issues. There are issues about government's own capacity, which I think you touched on, Lysa, and governments wanting to own it more. There's issues with the budgetary constraints in the U.S. context, and the way the president didn't say more money, He said lots of other things. He did not say more money. So I'm just curious if you all could comment for us on what does this mean, that ODA is less important? Of course, we believe it's important. It's critical. I think government investment is critical. But what does that change mean for this post-2015 conversation? Anyone want to pick that up first?
I can try that.
Okay.
So let's put some numbers on this for a second. The U.S. government provides $30 billion worth of development assistance in ODA each year. My agency does about 2/3 of that. Your community, NGOs, faith-based organizations, provide $40 billion a year. Remittances from people in the United States to developing countries is $100 billion each year. Private sector investment from all sources is $1 trillion each year, and domestic resource mobilization within the countries themselves is $8 trillion each year.
8 trillion?
Yes, that's how much countries are generating for their own development around the world. And so this notion that the $30 billion that the U.S. government is providing is the be-all and end-all is indeed a past notion. For us, within the U.S. government, it means we have to adopt a different approach. We have to look at partnerships with the NGO community, with the private sector, with international institutions. We have to look at convening authority, where we can draw people together. We have to look at reducing risk for your operations, for private sector investment. We have to look at areas where we can take risk as a government, calculated risks, but in areas where private investors or the NGO sector wouldn't normally go. And because of this, we have to recognize the importance of partnerships. And we've done some 1,600 partnerships, and public-private partnerships does not just mean between the U.S. government and a private business, because I am convinced that the only partnerships that truly work are whole-of-society partnerships that involve host governments, that involve the NGO sector, that involve private business, that involve others. The other important element to remember here is that it doesn't always take money. And I keep going back. We have just announced this partnership for a tropical forest alliance. 450 companies representing $3.1 trillion worth of sales have committed to eliminate deforestation from their supply chain by the year 2020 for palm oil, for paper and pulp, for beef, and for soybeans. They are now linking with host governments. They're now linking with NGOs. They're now linking with the U.S. government to figure out how to do this. And the key reason that they're doing it, there are two, I believe. One is they recognize that this is in their profit interest. But two, we offered them the chance to announce this with President Obama at the White House, still the single biggest home court advantage in development, the White House.
Our home court advantage. That's interesting framing. Carolyn wanted to speak to the ODA issue, and then I'd like for Jean-Michel to as well.
Sure. Just a couple of short points. I mean, I think Don's numbers are very illustrative, and they do really say there is the funding. The money is there. I don't think this is about we need lots of new money, although I would say this time we are dealing with some of the tougher problems because of this inequality issue. But I think it's making sure that the money is focused on the right things and that there's transparency, back to what Lysa was talking about in terms of civil society, you know, making sure that there is transparency on is the money going to the things for the development agenda or not. And so that to me is a huge part of this.
Jean-Michel, since you know all about impact investing and can tell us all about it in 30 seconds or less.
Just building on what has just been said, I think we have all to be aware that if we want to bring an end to poverty in the coming, or extreme poverty at least in the coming 20 years, we need much more funding than what we have right now. And much more funding first coming from economic growth. this type of ambition is not feasible if you don't have in the developing world, for instance, at least 5 or 6% economic growth a year. We are below those numbers right now. And the situation in the OECD countries doesn't help, because we won't reach 6% annual growth in developing countries if we don't have also growth in OECD countries, which are the first markets of those countries. So the macroeconomic framework that we experience now is not up to the ambition. I think it's very important stated. And even if it were, we would have to know the barrier to jump would be much higher than the barrier that we jumped in the past 15 years. First, because of these inequality issues that has been so rightly stressed, and which involves that we have to have very strong redistributive or better or improved macro and micro policies everywhere. And second, because we are facing this wall of the environmental constraint that we neglected also for very long, and which is making all things much more difficult. So we shouldn't start with an optimistic view about the fact that all our funding issues are going to be solved. Now, having said that, it's also very clear that pure government money will be probably a minor share of the effort than what it has been in the past 15 or 20 years, and there's a need for a much wider range of international arrangements, improved economic and social policies, and intervention from all actors dedicated to our global challenges. One of the things that we need if we want to make the best of our limited resources is to be much more imaginative about the way we use them. So this also through better partnerships, better coordination, better delivery, but also much more creativity around instruments and reaching out to our ultimate targets. So what is fine is that we have some of those ideas are now coming on the table and are ready to be mainstreamed. And this is the story about impact investment that has now been experienced for 10, 15 years in many places, and represents a category of instruments that can leverage grants on one hand, and purely private investments on the other hand. And the idea is that there are many areas in our social challenges where you could use private money or social money rather than using purely grants or taxpayers' money. And as a consequence, you can, with lesser burden on individuals, reach out to very important targets that we still have in common. So this can be about creating jobs, but it can be also about addressing educational challenges, improving access to health, delivering ecological services. So there's a very wide range of activities in which you can develop those instruments. And I'm experiencing it myself, being involved in an impact firm which is fully dedicated to Africa and to the creation of entrepreneurship, the support to entrepreneurship and to middle class. What I find great is that this is a wonderful opportunity to bring together the foundations, the NGO community, and traditional private investors to work together and build on what they have to, they know best, and they can do best. We do it ourselves by coordinating, by working very closely, for instance, with a foundation dedicated to education, and setting up an investment fund, which with very low financial returns for their investors, that are fully dedicated to access to education. So bring investors and NGOs is really a very nice way to improve our efficiency and to go one step further.
Lysa, you want to speak to the ODA? And
just to quickly say that I think the two dimensions that are coming up really strongly in this debate is one, the role of the middle income countries. and how we're going to really share lessons in terms of the way we've worked in North America or in Europe with, how civil society is also organizing itself in Asia and other parts of the world. And the second really is the role of the private sector. And I think in most of the conversations we've had, we're finding that civil society has kind of been missing that piece in terms of how they want to strategically look at the fact that many governments are putting their hands up and saying that we will actually not be able to put in more money because we're already in a difficult position ourselves. So basically the private sector needs to step in and start financing a lot of the development initiatives. But do we really have safeguards or monitoring, kind of mechanisms for that? How does that work? I think that's a conversation that really needs to be had.
A whole nother level of the transparency debate, government and then corporate. That's fascinating to think about. I want to go back to the issue of inequality. We've all sort of talked about, inequality is a bad thing, and that's a limitation of the first iteration. But it's a very challenging topic. As of, my previous life was a civil rights lawyer, so I believe we should, have laws on all of that. But how do we get at this challenge of inequality and the most marginalized populations that Don alluded to in his opening remarks? How do we work that in this time around?
Well, for me, there are a couple of points here. First of all, we have to assure that even as governments are driving development results and efforts within their own country, that reflects a whole of society goal. So we have to give voice to marginalized populations. We have to ensure that development priorities, including the ones that we set globally in the MDGs, do indeed reflect the will of the population. We have an expression we always use at AID, nothing about them without them. And one of the ways that we're going to see this impact is through modern technology. One of the differences, two of the differences between now and when the MDGs started, first of all, we didn't have 6.5 billion cell phones in the world. And that's going to change everything. That's going to change holding governments accountable. It's going to change the use of cell phones as diagnostic tools for medicine. It's going to change how we do education, et cetera. We didn't have Facebook in 2000. It didn't exist. And now it is an everyday part of the world. And so this notion of being able to use popular media to hold governments accountable for development results, I think, is very important. It also impacts one other aspect of the MDGs, and that is our need for extreme flexibility. Because I don't know about you, but I don't know what the Facebook of 2035 is going to be. But I know the world of 2035, and I hope I'm around for it, is going to be very similar in terms of the goals we're trying to achieve, but very, very different in the tools that we have available.
Any other thoughts on sort of how to work in measures or concrete ideas around inequality? That's really tough. Carolyn?
Well, I think actually if you're setting zero targets, if you're setting goals that are about ending extreme poverty or ending childhood deaths, you are, in effect, you are getting to the inequality issue by setting the goal that way. So I think that's part of why I think the push for even though people will say you're not going to get all the way there and there's always going to be this little leftover, part of this that doesn't get done, the aspiration of that zero goal is going to force you to look at where are those hardest to reach people, where are the hardest to reach children, families. It's going to force you to do that. So I think at the top, setting those kinds of goals is what's going to really help. And then I think within the way in which those goals are achieved, very important what Don was saying in terms of engaging. I mean, part of what we've done is actually go out and talk to poor children about what they want to have in these goals and what they think is important. And continuing to do that in a very regular way, I think, is going to lead you to, and going to the poorest places to talk to the poorest families, not just those that are easiest to reach.
So what did the poorest children tell you they want?
Well, they talked about education. They talked about jobs. I mean, back to Jean-Michel's, premise, they want to be participating in the economy. They want to be able to, develop their countries themselves. So that was a huge part of what they wanted. They obviously wanted, you know, health and clean water, and they did talk about the environment. A lot of them are living in very, you know, obviously extremely difficult circumstances from a, you know, a environment standpoint, so they see that, and they think that's going to come back to them, so that they're going to have to deal with that. So they want that, those kinds of issues.
Jean-Michel, do you have words on the inequality challenge?
Yes, I think it's very important that we have some type of goal that addresses very strongly the inequality issue, and this issue is put as one of the core issues and challenges that we have to face. And by the way, I'm not sure that this will happen. There's a lot of debate within the panel on that, and when we come to the stage where you have this big negotiation, you know, amongst governments in the UN General Assembly and so forth, it will be a very tough issue. But it's very important we do it because, you know, in an episode of growth, as many developing countries experience, you would expect to see inequalities increase. That's kind of a basic macroeconomic thing that one has observed over the decades. Now, what is striking now is that the level of the magnitude of the increase of these inequalities is so strong. It's really an unexperienced ever event in the history of the world. So we are facing something that is very, very, very exceptional, and that is so strong that you could really fear that it will make this episode of growth unsustainable at some stage, and we may face a reverse in the trends that we experience. Part of the story is due to the economic models that many developing countries are following. The export-oriented model by very nature provokes this set of inequalities. So as a consequence, it's very important that there is a consensus or the wide majority about the fact that it is very important that will be addressed, because without very strong collective intervention, whether by governments or by communities and civil societies, there won't be a real natural mechanisms that will stop this growing level of inequality. So we are here very much in front of face to a public concern, to very strong political and policy issues that requires human intervention. I mean, economy is not going to fix the problem by the virtue of the market. On the contrary, it's going to increase in. At one stage, we'll see a collapse there. So this is probably to me, one of the single most important areas of lobbying around those future MDGs.
Lysa, do you see civil society energy around this, and how is it manifesting?
I was just thinking that I'm in a better position than Mr. Severino, but because unlike him, I don't have to attribute all my comments to the panel. I can just say I heard it from civil society somewhere else. so maybe I should raise a few more difficult questions. And I think in relation to inequality, what we're strongly hearing is the idea of inequality within and between countries. But the challenge really is how does that play out beyond a certain level of rhetoric. So for instance, the MDG declaration clearly mentioned that the investment in these developed countries, LDCs, as part of the inheritance that they would like to see, in terms of the commitment that people made towards the declaration. The LDC voice and agenda is the least visible in the post-2015 debate at this point of time. You really don't have an organized civil society strategy to really address how you're reaching LDC governments as well as how you're mobilizing civil society in LDCs. At the same time, I think in terms of how, to kind of also detailing what we want to hear in relation to the word inequality. So a lot of people are saying that inequality is the most important issue in the post-2015 agenda, but everybody may be using it in different ways. So I was actually thinking of the photograph that you showed here, the aftermath. And I think it really means about saying, saying that are we okay with the idea of ending extreme poverty, or do we want to push for the idea of ensuring prosperity for all countries and communities? And that's also the conversation that we're hearing from a lot of spaces saying that the post-2015 agenda, unlike the MDGs phase, is not going to be only about ending extreme poverty. It's also going to be about ensuring prosperity for all individuals and communities and countries. And then how do we reframe? So is it just going to be airdropped packets of relief in that photograph there? Or is it going to be challenging issues of land and resources and decision making in terms of, and transfer of technology in terms of how you deal with a situation like that?
So you're saying that we have to get at some of the structural issues.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, which is pretty radical. So thinking then about another sort of restructuring issue, this is the last question for the panel, and then I want to open it up for discussion. Universality is like, oh, it's very easy to say, universality, but it has huge implications because you're talking about behavior change in this country, in Europe, in lots of places, in different ways that are uncomfortable for countries and uncomfortable for people. But it keeps getting to, oh, these need to be universal. Can I get you all to comment on even whether this is politically feasible or other issues that you'd like to take up with it? Carolyn, do you want to start?
Sure. So first of all, I think it is what we should do. So, you know, if I look, we're putting out a report next week on State of the World's Mothers. U.S. is 30th, right? So the worst in the developing countries at the bottom for newborn deaths. So it's not like there isn't things that we should be ourselves paying attention to. So I know I should be saying I want it, and I do want it, but I am afraid of the political ramifications, and I am afraid that it's going to be, you know, the perfect will be the enemy of the good, and that it will sink the ship. So I should be behind it, but I do worry practically about whether or not we could actually make that work. So hopefully maybe the high-level panel is working on this and they have a solution. So,
Exactly.
Because
Exactly.
I don't see one actually.
Yeah, that's very difficult. Jean-Michel, can you comment on that for us?
Yes, well, it's probably one of the hottest issues right now around those goals. The work of our panel has not ended, so I should be cautious, but it's likely that there will be strong messages around universality because we are not supposed to negotiate politically, and we are supposed to make comments and proposals that should not deal with the political feasibility. Now, you should also, if we come with this kind of conclusion, you should remember that we have three co-chairs, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the President of Indonesia, and the President of Liberia. Okay, quite represented. And by the way, we have several foreign ministers, several ministers of environment of different sets of countries, very senior officials in these panels. So if this group of people comes with the idea that we have to move towards a real universal set of goals, is that there's something, that is strong that even politicians or very senior politicians and world leaders think is really worth coming to grips with. Now, there are of course very important challenges behind that. You talked about this political feasibility issue, and I agree that there are risks behind it. There are also all sorts of technical challenges or more technical challenges. What does it mean? Does it mean, for instance, that when we talk about the health-related goals, we'll have goals about obesity or illnesses that are diseases that are more specific to OECD countries, for instance? Maybe. It may be also that there will be stress on goals that are really universal. For instance, I think it's going to be very, very clear that we'll have a self-standing goal on women. And the issue of women is something that is really cutting across all countries in the world. Several of the environmental goals are goals that are really fully shared by all countries. And by the way, it is not surprising if you think about it that people coming from developing countries stress the need for those universal goals, because there's the question of all these shared goals around the environment, etc., that are seen from developing countries as preconditions for their own development and are not in their hands. And the second is an issue of pride. I've been, I did not expect that myself, but I've been extremely impressed by the strength with which several very senior people coming from developing countries said we are just shamed with the MDGs. We are the object of compassion for the world, and the world is around us, wondering how they can help us moving out of poverty. And there's something we cannot live with. So the very way the MDGs are worded, with all the goodwill that is behind, and with all the good things that they've helped to deliver, have also a content, substance that is difficult to swallow for some. And I think also that's a reason for which there's this temptation to move towards this universality of goals. And they're saying, look guys, we have shared challenges for all the planet. Some are more specific to some countries than others, but everybody has to do something in this context. So we'll see whether this flies in the political arena, and I'm fully aware that this may not be the case, but there's a strong ground behind that.
Fascinating. Lysa, could you talk a little bit, because you raised that issue of the gaps originally, and then we'll end with Don.
No, I think for me, universality is an idea that's inescapable. We in the policy domain may want to kind of skirt around it, but if you go into the real world, it's something that you just can't escape. But I would prefer not to use it as a beating stick that you kind of rap each other on the knuckles on in terms of your responsibilities, but simply as a concept of interdependence. I think we live in a world right now which is more interdependent than ever before in terms of both thematically as well as in terms of the way that both people and governments work. I think when we're talking about a post-2015 agenda, we probably also need to keep in mind that just even a decade from now or even 5 years from now, the entire process of how citizens and governments relate to each other would be so different just because of information technology and so much else. And the starting point for me really is the 2011, the uprisings that we've seen across the world, and the way that people have just been able to connect their issues and really create a kind of a momentum for change in a way that has been simply unprecedented. So I think the post-2015 agenda really is not so much a global conversation as it is a global catharsis, because it really needs to be a way to really link with the energies you're seeing on the ground, both the anger but also the aspiration. And having said that, I must say that since we're in the United States, I think one of the assets really for this whole conversation is also our panelist from this country, John Podesta. Everywhere I go, I think from Asia to Latin America, I was in Mexico, especially young people, I think, connect with the kind of ideas he has and the way that he kind of speaks to them in terms of their agenda and aspirations, and that's something I hope that you would also be able to build on once the panel's report is out.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Yeah. So, Don, talk about universality.
Well, universality...
Or interdependence. I like that word.
Makes total sense, but let's be clear what it really means. If we're talking about ending extreme poverty, which we define as individuals under $1.25 a day, we don't have extreme poverty in the United States. We have a lot of poverty. We have a lot of relative poverty, but we don't have extreme poverty. Almost by definition, we do not have, quote, preventable child deaths in the OECD countries, because preventable child deaths is defined as bringing the child death level in developing countries to the OECD average. So almost by definition, you don't have that kind of universality in that context. But let's not play semantics here. Let's recognize that what most countries mean by universality is that everybody has a responsibility to contribute to the development challenges that we're facing. Everyone has a responsibility to recognize that these are global goals that benefit us as much as they do developing countries, that we're all combined in this effort. And what I think is most important in the dialogue that's now taking place in the high-level panel is how transparent people are being, how they're willing to put these issues all on the table. You know, I remember leading the delegation of the United States to the Lesser Developed Countries Forum in Istanbul, and I couldn't even mention a year and a half ago fragile states. Countries would not accept that the Americans would talk about fragile states. Now, following Monrovia and the G7+, we've got countries that are self-identifying as fragile, and they're putting it on the table. And they're saying nothing is taboo in terms of the dialogue, and let's recognize that this is too important to hide behind labels like universality, and that we need to really talk about what we're all going to contribute to this effort.
That's very encouraging, and it does sort of sound like global catharsis.
Indeed.
That's fascinating. So I'd love to have some questions from the audience. Do we have a mic somewhere in the back? A mic person? We have 2 mic persons. Okay, I see someone in an orange headpiece.
Thank you. My name is Nyara Zai. I'm the General Secretary of the World YWCA. It's good to see colleagues again on the panel and to hear a very clear message around the commitment to issues of gender equality and women's human rights and women's empowerment. I always talk about equality, empowerment, and rights as the conceptual framework within which the MDGs should respond, because equality without rights or without empowerment would be insufficient. I have 2 concrete comments, and also following through my presence being in Monrovia for the high-level panel discussions. The first is, I feel we need to do a little bit of more discussion around the current values, the current principles which are in the declaration of the MDGs. Because there's a lot of good conversation around the goals and the targets, but somehow I feel an insufficiency of a conversation around the principles which are currently in the current declaration. Those are the issues around human rights, the issues around the intersection between development and security, because those would also then inform on how our governments prioritize military expenditure and development expenditure issues. I think that piece of the discussion, I feel we need to reflect on it, and maybe this conversation we've had on universality is important in terms of reflecting on those principles. My second comment is around something that bothers me every day, and I think in the morning I shared a little bit about my own personal life. It pains me that Africa is not poor, for example. And yet the narrative is as if it is poor. How do we shift the narrative that women and girls might be licking the spoon, or women and their children, but this is not actually a poor continent? And how can the MDGs reformulate, reposition the conversation, whether it's the investment discussion, the trade discussion, the governance discussion, the community empowerment discussion, in a way that we start to shift the possibility of really getting out of poverty with what is available in my neighborhood. I feel that piece is also something that I have an expectation on. The last is around, I live in Geneva, I live in Switzerland. I feel the conversation on universality is important at another level of how do we ensure equality of opportunities in developed countries within the threshold of those developed countries. Because I live in a developed country and I come to the US often. At times I see a lot of inequalities within the developed countries themselves. So to what extent do the MDGs offer an opportunity for lifting equality within the developed countries themselves? Because that equally is a collective global commitment to human dignity and universality of the values that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. 3 really good points. The values in the Millennium Declaration, shifting the narrative about Africa, and what do we do about equality of opportunity in the developed world? We've got 3 questions, so you can play with whatever most interests you.
I think the interesting thing really, I mentioned this before, was really the regional voices that you're hearing in this agenda. You've spoken about, Africa's perception of itself and the people and civil society of Africa talking about an alternate narrative. I think that's come not just from Africa, but also the Arab states. It's come from Asia, it's come from Latin America. And I think as some of us who've been, part of these global summits and conversations for the last decade or so, it's very, very refreshing to see this kind of voice coming very, very strongly to the front. My only challenge would be that can we ensure that these voices are also reaching the member states in those regions and across regions as effectively. I sometimes jokingly tell people who reach me that if people put half the effort they did to reach the panel, at least half of that effort to actually reach their own governments also on in terms of educating them of these positions and responses, I'm sure we'd have a much more stronger and radical debate.
Yeah. Who else would like to pick up any of that? Jean-Michel?
Yeah, maybe about Africa. I don't know how far we'll be able to go in this panel about the description of the economic situation or social situation in each and every continent, but there will be sure some words about Africa, which is of course a very important frontier for development and social improvement in the world. What I would like to say and share is that growth in Africa has been rather impressive in the past 15 years, more than 5% a year, but actually it's also a very unbalanced, uneven growth in many ways. There are a lot of questions about whether it is sustainable, both on political grounds, both on environmental grounds. And I wouldn't say that the story of growth and development in Africa is over, and we should just declare victory and say that from now on things are going to be okay. Africa remains a continent with a very fragile growth, with very important social challenges, a very fragile social tissue, and highly related with the fact that the continent is growing about 2.5%. Its population is growing 2.5% a year. It's still probably a little bit less now, on average. That it is generating an unprecedented episode of population in the continent, with a lot of migration, an unprecedented speed of urbanization. More African cities are growing more than 10% a year. One has never experienced such growth in the world history, and all this is challenging the society to an extreme point. So many things are going to occur in the coming decades in Africa. It's going to be a very volatile, shaky continent, and it remains a very important place to act and to operate, because the good side of the story being that there are also a lot of opportunities. So we after 25 years of structural adjustment in Africa, now has come a time when we can hope that the continent is going to follow the path of Asia or other parts of the world. But the story is not written, and a lot of things remain to be done. Just a very small footnote on the inequality issue. There's been a discussion with the panel about whether there should be a goal around a kind of Gini index that would be applied to all countries in the world.
A what index?
No, an inequality index.
Okay.
Inequality index. And I'm not sure that we'll end with that, but it's already interesting that in a group like that, with once more majority of governmental officials from very varied countries, this has taken time to even, say that we would not do it and we will not propose it. So this type of idea that we have come to a time where inequalities are so strong, so high, not that much between countries, because actually they are narrowing between countries, but within countries. that this has now become a kind of huge global social challenge, and something has to be done about it. But I'm not sure, I'm even sure that we have not found a way to phrase that challenge and to put it in a way that is acceptable for a vast majority of countries, and it's probably a big disappointment that we are not able to do that and to forge a world consensus on that. But the reality is that the challenge is just absolutely extraordinary, and probably once more, to put it, a core challenge for everybody who is working on social and environmental policies today.
Don, did you want to speak
Just
to those remarks?
to pick up on a point that Carolyn was making and to respond to the last point, I frankly do not believe that the MDGs represent an opportunity to address poverty in the United States or address healthcare conditions, et cetera. I think that's probably a stretch too far. That said, my strong hope is that the MDGs can be a mechanism for building popular support in the United States for international development purposes. It can be an opportunity to remind people of what we benefit as a country in terms of economic advantage, and in that sense, development abroad clearly reflects itself in an elimination of poverty in the United States. As we all know, 13 of our fastest growing 20 export markets are in developing countries right now. I also believe that the confluence of the MDGs and, in a strange sort of sense, the budget stringency we're seeing right now is going to come together in a way that will help us develop better policies globally. Rahm Emanuel once said, "Never waste a good crisis." And so we now face a budget crisis here, and as I think you're aware, we have come forward with a proposal to reform how we're doing food aid. And that will result, we believe, in our capacity to address some 2 to 4 million more needy people around the world with exactly the same resources that we now have. I believe that in the context of a tough budget and a reaffirmed commitment to global poverty elimination, that we can take some pretty remarkable steps as we move ahead.
That's pretty exciting. Carolyn, would
Just
you
to
like to?
pick up a little bit on that and something that the speaker said about values and principles, I do think those values and principles are the things that can help us be able to explain the MDGs in this next go-round. I mean, in one of our sessions earlier, I think somebody described it as it's been a great marketing tool, but has it really done everything it needs to be? But I don't think we should underestimate the fact that you do need that marketing piece of this. You do need, and whether it's developed countries or developing countries, you need the mass population to understand these things, and it would be a much more powerful initiative and movement here if we had the public actually behind these things, whether you're talking about the public in the United States or whether you're talking about the public in Liberia. And so appealing on these things about human development, about development and security, and the match of development and security, those are the kinds of things that we can use to craft different arguments that will actually get the public engaged, which I think didn't happen for a long time on the current MDGs. I mean, it took us all a long time to, even those of us in the development world, a while to understand what those 8 things were. And it certainly took the public, I mean, to this day, I think that there's still just a small part of the public that knows, but using technology and using, young people, frankly, to get this idea out there and to be taken up, I think could be immensely powerful.
Can I
Yeah,
pick up on
yeah.
that security argument? Because I think it's one that we do not exploit enough as a development community. We are in the process of trying to get out of Afghanistan. And we keep talking about the key to stability in Afghanistan being a empowered police force and an empowered military in Afghanistan. But I think the answer is really an empowered Afghan people. What gives me hope looking ahead is not necessarily how many police or military we have trained, but the fact that there are 3 million girls in school right now compared to 0 a decade ago. The fact that maternal mortality and infant mortality has declined by 60% over the course of the last decade. The fact that life expectancy for women today is 15 years longer than it was a decade ago, 47 years to 62 years. And when we were in Tokyo for the Afghan Reconstruction Conference, every single donor was talking about the important role of women in building civil society and building a stable Afghanistan, such that Hamid Karzai had to say, we will not sacrifice the success we've achieved for women on the altar of a negotiation with the Taliban. That link between our national security and our capacity to bring our troops home and development is key. We had Admiral Stavridis come and talk to USAID. He's the head of NATO right now. And he said, we are not going to fight our way out of Afghanistan. We're going to develop our way out of Afghanistan.
So it's all about building a more just, stable, and prosperous world. I want to thank each of the panelists for the work that they're all individually doing. I want to thank everybody in this room for the work that you do. It's an honor to be associated with you all. An honor to see the role that civil society can play in partnership with all of these actors in moving this global agenda forward. I think